And in that way, our film is dangerous to those who are perpetuating the myths that we dispel in the film, like the myth that there is only one cause for gender dysphoria, the myth that social transition and medical transition is the only treatment, the myth that these approaches to gender distressed young people will prevent suicide rather than increase the likelihood of suicide. So we break down all these myths that their activism is resting upon. So it's understandably that they perceived us as dangerous to their ideology, but the myth is that we're a danger to them, and we're not a danger to anybody. We're coming from a place of compassion and care.
I'm here today with Stephanie Winn, host of the podcast You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist and associate producer of the film No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. Stephanie, welcome to Brave New Us.
Thanks for having me, Samantha. Good to be here.
Could you introduce yourself and share how you came to be doing the work that you're doing?
Sure. I've been a therapist since I graduated in 2013. I've been licensed since 2016. I've lived in California and Oregon. I've worked with a variety of populations from more intensive community mental health settings to more general populations. And over the last couple years, I quickly went from being just a therapist to a therapist and also a public figure. It was a combination of sort of an organically evolving desire to start a podcast and sort of broaden my reach because I was having so many conversations in the context of therapy where we were touching on sort of common themes that were emerging in one conversation after another. And I wanted a bit more creative freedom to have those conversations with a wider variety of people. But also the moment I became a public figure, became sort of known as the gender heretic amongst therapists. So I've ended up kind of getting pigeonholed into this role because after doing research for a couple years, I came out very concerned about the alarming trends with regard to what's called gender affirming care in my field. And so because I spoke up, because I learned about what was happening to detransitioners and heartbroken parents, I've ended up just having a lot of requests and opportunities and heartbroken people coming to me as a result of that. And so through that, I've gotten involved in the film No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. It's really an honor to be representing the film to just the general public. We have some very hardworking people behind the scenes.
Great. Well, tell us about the film. What will we see and how did it come about?
Sure. So No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. Some people might have heard of it in its sort of early pre-launch phase. It was called Affirmation Generation, but since we've been picked up by a global distributor, which we're very grateful for, it's now No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. People can watch it now at nowaybackfilm.com, and you can use my promo code Some Therapist to get 20% off. So No Way Back aims to take a very compassionate and careful view at what's going on with detransitioners. In other words, people who at one point in their lives believes that they were transgender or that they would be better off if they could transition to being the opposite sex. And so they pursued social transition and medical interventions to try to live that way, only to find out that that was not a solution to their problems. And indeed, it made their problems worse. So we follow the stories of 5 detraners and 1 sister from childhood to various forms of trauma that happened in their lives, how they came to believe that this was the explanation for their distress or the cure for it, what the initial stages, sort of the honeymoon phase was like, and then how it all fell apart, the consequences that they suffered, the loss of self, the loss of health and community, and the breakdown and everything that they thought they knew. And then from there, from their stories, we zoom out and talk to people like me, therapists, doctors, pediatricians, endocrinologists, researchers, and journalists and sociologists about how did we get here? How did a generation of vulnerable people get swept up in believing these radical ideas and pursuing these life-altering interventions during a time? And eventually we follow the money and we look at the industry that is driving this. And along the way, we break down a lot of myths and misconceptions. So the producers worked very hard to create a film that meets a lot of needs, sort of like if someone is willing to spend 90 minutes doing one thing to learn about the gender crisis, we hope this film would be a compassionate and a comprehensive answer to all of their questions. And we're
I think
hoping for it.
it is. I've seen the film. It's fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough. I understand though that there was some problems with the theatrical run. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so after we partnered with a global distributor, we had a really exciting opportunity to show the film in AMC theaters, select theaters around the country. I believe there were over 100 different locations, and that was scheduled to be on June 21st. So, of course, we were spreading the word and, encouraging all of our community to buy their tickets. And, of course, quite understandably, a trans activist group called the QT Project caught wind of our efforts and harassed AMC and basically created a huge administrative nightmare for them with lots of phone calls and emails. And eventually, understandably, AMC caved under the pressure and decided to cancel the screening. We're not mad at AMC, we understand, but it is sad that things have come to this point. And I think it says a lot about these activists that those are the lengths that they will go to because our film does a really good job at telling a compassionate story that is well researched with medical literature and caring, educated professionals. And in that way, our film is dangerous to those who are perpetuating the myths that we dispel in the film, like the myth that there is only one cause for gender dysphoria, the myth that social transition and medical transition is the only treatment, the myth that these approaches to gender distressed young people will prevent suicide rather than increase the likelihood of suicide. So we break down all these myths that their activism is resting upon. So it's understandably that they perceived us as dangerous to their ideology, but the myth is that we're a danger to them, and we're not a danger to anybody. We're coming from a place of compassion and care. And a lot of the people who have tried to censor this film, a few years down the line, they might face regret or detransition, at least ideologically, if not medically, themselves as well.
That's so interesting. The push to kind of suppress dialogue about what's going on. Do you know if, and maybe you don't have a way of knowing this, but do you know if any of them had a chance to see the film that they were trying to
I
remove?
don't know. That's a really good question. From what I've observed in the trends and sort of the cultural norms of those types of activists, there seems to be sort of a hysterical level of fear and anger that anything that threatens their belief system is an actual threat of violence against them as a person. They even use phrases like genocide, right? They believe that they're being genocided. So our ideas are considered sort of radioactive. So I doubt that they would actually take the time to watch, or that if they were taking the time to watch, that it would be with a remotely open mind. But that's a really great question. I'd be curious to know that too.
I guess hopefully someday we're able to find out. So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is the propaganda in our culture. And one of the ways that propaganda functions is to kind of twist language to promote certain false understandings of reality and sometimes in kind of clever ways. And so the term I'm thinking of here is gender affirmation. And it's baffling to me how this term could be used for the actions that are taken for the type of treatment that it's used to describe. Because it seems to me that that it's the opposite of affirming someone's gender. So that's kind of a long preface, but could you describe the treatment path that we're talking about when someone says gender affirmation? What's involved there?
I think you raise a really important point, and we are living in a time where there's a lot of Orwellian type use of language. So the phrase gender affirming care is misleading. In fact, it is sex denying harm. It is medical harm that denies the reality of our biological sex. Affirmation makes it sound so positive. Who doesn't want to be affirmed? But the phrase gender affirming care implies that there is this intrinsic gendered self, you could say a soul, that a person can connect with way deep down inside through some process of self discovery. And that once they discover that gendered part of themselves, this is more real than the sex of their body and more important than the health of their body. And so then it becomes not only that person's job, but the job of everyone around them and the medical system to affirm what this person has discovered deep within themselves at the expense of harm to their body and to their natal sex. So what does that process look like? Well, it first of all, it rests on a belief system that these young people are at higher risk of suicide if you don't affirm them, which is absolutely untrue. I mean, if that were true, after having done my research, if I found that that was true, if I found that this was actually necessary for suicide prevention, then I would not be speaking out against it because I'm all for suicide prevention. In fact, it's my job as a therapist. It is literally my job to understand suicide prevention. So it rests on this idea that young people will commit suicide. Now, these people are distressed. There's no doubt about that. Nobody disagrees. But the understanding that the cause of their distress is this sense of this mismatch between their intergendered part and their sex, the sex of their body, and that therefore it's the body that must change. Those are some big leaps there, right? The way that I think of it is more like a young person is in distress and they've been offered a very convenient narrative to answer their problems and to give them a direction to move in. But anyway, so there's this idea in the mental and medical healthcare systems that this young person knows this about themselves and that if you don't support them, they're going to commit suicide. And so from there, there's a sense of urgency. And it's even this way around puberty blockers. So with these trans identifying youth who are prepubescent or in the early stages of puberty, the sort of myth that has been perpetuated in my field is that their body is like this ticking time bomb that's on a roller coaster. I'm mixing my metaphors now, but basically the clock is ticking and something really bad is about to happen, which is that they're about to go down this irreversible pathway of what they call the wrong puberty. In other words, their body's own natural puberty is like a danger to this special gendered soul that they have. And so then from there, there's this idea that you have to rescue kids from this bad thing happening that will just traumatize them, right? If they develop secondary sex characteristics, it's going to be so much harder to be their true selves. In reality, it couldn't be further from the case because of youth who do have gender dysphoria, 90% of the time, it'll disappear by adulthood if you simply allow them to go through puberty. So really, people are being lied to and told the quite literal opposite of the truth. But that's the idea, right? That you have to rescue these kids who magically know their inner selves from this ticking time bomb by preventing them from developing secondary sex characteristics. That's where puberty blockers come in. Unfortunately, puberty blockers block an entire developmental phase that is crucial for the brain. It's even crucial for the skeletal system. So when we block puberty, we're preventing psychological and emotional development, increasing risk of brain swelling and blindness, and inducing potentially lifelong disabilities through weakening the skeletal system during a crucial phase of development. When I talk about suicide prevention, this is one of the main things I'm concerned about because as someone who is trained in suicide prevention as a licensed psychotherapist, I understand what the risk factors are. And I've been taught how to formally assess someone's level of suicide risk based on all the sort of areas of life in which they're weak and then areas of life in which they have some supports. And so losing the health of your physical body, being in pain, being disabled, unable to go out and enjoy recreational activities, get outside, be physically active, do things with your loved ones, that is a major suicide risk factor. And we are setting children up for it at a young age when they have no idea what they want. Another major problem with puberty blockers is that if they are administered at the early stage that and ideologues are recommending, then these children may never experience any sexual functioning. If they've never had an orgasm and then they take puberty blockers, they're never going to have an orgasm. Even trans doctor Erica Anderson admitted that to the world. So, but this is the path that's being proposed, right? All resting on this idea that this child knows themselves and has discovered something profound, and that you have to affirm that over their long term health, and that it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth not being healthy as an adult. It's going to be worth not being able to function sexually or to have your own children. So it's a lot of sort of risky and unfounded assumptions that this is all based on. Then you go on to cross-sex hormones and various forms of surgery, ranging from females getting their breasts removed, males getting breast implants, to all manner of horrific things that we can generally euphemistically refer to as bottom surgery, which always have huge rates of complications and pain and pelvic and urogenital dysfunction. And then the cross-sex hormones, the long-term effects of those, you're looking at increased cardiovascular risk, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, cancer, blood clots, the list goes on. Plus mood swings. These are mood altering chemicals. And that's the main reason that there is this short-term euphoria that some people experience, that and the placebo effect, the fact that they've built it up in their minds is something to look forward to that's going to alleviate their stress. But does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, it does. And it's interesting. And then listening to this list of dramatic risks and I guess the cost of to the future of this person who's going through these procedures. I'm thinking about a child making this decision, and it seems crazy to me that we would put this kind of decision into the hands of a child and to tell them, yes, you're capable of deciding whether or not you ever want children at this age. You're capable of deciding, these things. I mean, we can't even give a kid a Tylenol at a school without parents' permission. And I guess maybe they do have their parents' permission, but it's just, I'm just kind of baffled by the fact that we would offer this to children and say, take the reins and make this decision. Are there other, I guess, instances when you're working with children that you can think of where there may be, you can recognize, oh, this person has limited agency, and so we work with them through this mental period of distress in a different way. And in your opinion, do you think that some of those might be better to help a child who's going through this period that, as you say, will resolve 90% of the time if they just make it through?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is just one example of the ways, the myriad ways that the way we handle gender in the mental health field is completely different from the way we handle any other issue. Because we are trained in understanding human development and the process of maturing, and we are trained in understanding family systems and social influence and things like that. And when you talk about giving a child the reins, letting them lead, that is not generally how a family systems oriented therapist would advise a family to handle any other issue. In fact, I would say most decent therapists know that that's an inappropriate amount of power for that child, which is actually deeply unsettling. Because if you are given more power than you know how to handle as a child, your anxiety is going to go through the roof. Now, you might act on the surface like you're glad to have that power because it's a child's developmental task at various stages, especially adolescence, to test their parents' limits, see how much they can get away with because they're figuring out how things work. And because in adolescence, as identity is forming, temporarily youth kind of create these alter egos, which a lot of trans stuff we can talk about alter egos if you want later. But youth kind of build these alter egos as a way of scaffolding the development of a true sense of identity. And so part of that alter ego is wanting your freedom and wanting your privileges. But that doesn't mean that deep down there isn't a part of the child feeling like, wait, I'm not supposed to be able to get away with this. Because a child wants what they want and they want it right now. And they don't have the maturity or the understanding of the world to be able to foresee where that's going to go. So that's why it is adults' job to set those limits and tell the children internalize them. Doesn't mean kids shouldn't be able to take healthy amounts of risk here and there, but there do need to be guardrails. I know this from the way I was parented myself. I didn't have certain limits that I needed as a child. And of course, as a child, I pushed to sort of get what I wanted because that's what kids do. But as an adult, I see how it had a negative impact on my development. And so I wonder for all these parents who are being misled into really believing, well, some parents believe this stuff wholeheartedly, other parents feel gaslit and bullied and exhausted into it by the whole system working against them. But I think that the kids who are pushing for these things now are likely to resent their parents. Either, I would say, resent their parents down the line for not holding up those guardrails in the same way that I've gone through my own resentment that I wasn't forced to eat my vegetables, right? Like, hey, I would have stronger bones, you know? So I think there might be some resentment. I also think that many detransitioners and people who experience regret feel a tremendous amount of guilt for how far they push their parents into it. And so that makes it difficult to repair that relationship.
Yeah, and we can see that there are lawsuits, not with regard to parents, but detransitioners who are holding the adults who allowed them to make these life-altering decisions at such a young age already. But I want to circle back talking about parents to the suicide question, because I think a lot of parents are, immediately alarmed because they're given this false dichotomy of, well, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? And Can you speak to that? How is this threat of suicide being, weaponized in this debate and to try to manipulate people into certain outcomes?
Sure. So I find it helpful when talking about suicide to separate out a few different elements of the picture of suicide. So there's ideation, which means any degree of thought about it. And as a therapist, I guess maybe my view was jaded because I am so accustomed to working with people during the most difficult times in their life. But suicidal ideation, as far as I can tell, is really common. There are lots of people who, during a depressive episode or a particularly rough time in their life, have some kind of thought like maybe everyone would be better off without me, or I just wish I could just end it all. And lots of people have those thoughts without ever coming close to acting on them. So ideation is one thing, right? Then there's behavior. So we have things we call parasuicidal behavior. So suicide adjacent be like self-harm without intent to end one's life. So that might be like cutting, for example, is really common for youth who are in a great deal of distress to cut themselves superficially in ways that don't pose a life-threatening risk, or overdosing on something that you can't actually really overdose on. It just makes you really sick. Now, sometimes there is a genuine intent to follow through, and we can just thank the youth's naivete for thinking that melatonin could take them out, for instance. That's like a good thing that they didn't do their research. But sometimes this sort of parasuicidal behavior is really more an expression of distress and a cry for help. And then there's actual planning suicide, having access to means, or being in a situation where you might act on that impulse, such as being in a high risk situation where there's alcohol involved, something to lower your inhibition. So, and then within all of that, there are various risk factors and protective factors. So, where I agree with trans rights activists on this issue is we do agree that youth who identify as trans are at higher risk of suicide in terms of if you lump all that together, suicidal ideation and behavior, just general distress, they have more distress. Where we don't agree is cause and effect, causality, correlation, and what it means we should do about it, right? So, what the trans rights activists would say is that they're at higher risk of suicide because they're discriminated against by horrible people like me, who they would also label homophobic because they lump gender identity ideology in with sexuality and other issues, and that it's all about discrimination and bias. And so that's why we have to work to normalize and even glorify being trans, because otherwise they're at higher risk of suicide because of all the social pressure. Of course, there's nothing inherently pathological according to this narrative, and identifying as trans or having gender dysphoria isn't a sign that there's something else going on that we should look at, like maybe sexual trauma or maybe some kind of family attachment issues, even though we see a lot of those issues. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So there is higher rates of distress, but these kids are being told in these online communities that are a part of that because they identify this way or because they feel this form of distress, that they should feel suicidal and that this is such a normal thing. So then they kind of latch onto that narrative, and oftentimes, unfortunately, sadly, they use it to get what they want because they are learning that this is a way that you can manipulate and frighten people. Of course, every parent's worst nightmare, worst fear is losing a child. So children know on some level that they can weaponize that. Now, I'm not saying they're not truly in distress, but I am saying on some level, in some cases, there's a degree of manipulation going on, consciously or not, because these kids have this urgency, this sense of I want what I want and I want it right now. And they've been sold this idea that this is what's going to cure their anxiety or their depression or their loneliness or they're not fitting in. This is what's going to meet their need for belonging. So, unfortunately, we know suicide risk is actually worse long term for those who do choose to medicalize. And that if you don't choose to medicalize and you work on accepting yourself exactly as you are, as the boy, girl, man, or woman that you were born as, that you can come to terms with yourself and you can go on to live a meaningful life. So, as I pointed out, a long-term suicide risk is heightened in anyone who's living with significant irreversible regret and medical pain and suffering, disability, impairment. These things do increase people's suicide risk. Another thing when it comes to suicide risk factors and protective factors is that relationships are a huge protective factor. I've talked to many people during depressive spells who have, confided in me that they did think of taking their life sometimes, but they would never do that to their spouse or their children. So when we take away people's sexual functioning at an early age before they have any idea what they're going to want or what they're going to be missing out on, then we're depriving them of that opportunity to meet someone, fall in love, have a family, have their own biological children that they're responsible for, that give their life joy and meaning, and children that motivate them to work through the hard times. These are just a few of the suicide risk factors and protective factors, but I think I'll pause there.
Right. So, I mean, as a therapist, and you're hearing that people are taking this path, this gender affirmation path, and sort of, I don't know, legitimizing the suicide or the suicidal ideation of people, of the kids who are experiencing this. And they say, oh, yes, we do need to give you these medical treatments because then you might commit suicide. I mean, what kind of message is that sending? Does that it seems like that would be the opposite of the thing that you would wanna say to somebody who might be at risk for that. Like, "Yes, you might commit suicide, so we have to do these things because" is that how
Absolutely. And sometimes it's being said really irresponsibly. I've heard cases from detransitioners saying that they had never had any suicidal and then a therapist said, "You're at risk of suicide if you don't do this." I mean, how irresponsible is that? But if we think about any other issue, that anything a kid might want, going out with my friends, an iPad, candy, okay? Whatever it might be, video games, whatever the kid might want. You think of any other instance of this kid saying, "Give me the iPad or I'll kill myself. Give me the Snickers bar or I'll kill myself." I'm sure kids have said those things to their parents, but when has it been an acceptable course of action for a therapist to step into that situation and say, "Well, mom, she's saying if you don't give her the candy, she's going to die, so you better give her the candy." Like, when has that been how we approach issues? And I said in the film that it is our job to affirm, to use a hot term, affirm people's resilience, even and especially when they don't believe it themselves. And if someone is saying, "If I don't get what I want, then there's no point in living," then that's not something I'm gonna endorse.
Mhm.
I'm gonna say, "I know that's how you feel right now. You're in a lot of distress right now, but I'm gonna hold on to that hope that there's a light at the end of the tunnel for you, and I'm gonna help you find your faith to walk through this."
Right. So when we're looking at the cause, do you have a sense or is there a consensus about what causes gender dysphoria?
There's certainly no consensus, especially given the divided nature of my field. Some people believe in this idea that you can be born in the wrong body, which is really a metaphysical belief that I personally don't endorse. I think something that we're not talking about enough in the gender critical community is the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment. So clearly it is a thought, it's an idea. So it's a social psychological meme that's being passed along. It's a narrative. But could there be any physiological underlying basis for some people saying, "I don't feel like a boy," or "I don't feel like a girl"? Well, we do know that from the work of people like Dr. Shanna Swan, who wrote a book called Countdown that I'm looking forward to reading. I've seen a few of her interviews. We know that sperm count in males has declined 50% in the last 50 years. We know that a lot of males with lower sperm counts have something called phthalate syndrome that can be measured through biomarkers that is passed down through the mothers. So it's an intergenerational impact of certain environmental pollutants as a result of our plastics in the environment. So we know that there are males with phthalate syndrome. There are a lot of females who present with gender related distress, have conditions like PCOS, which, as I understand it, I'm not saying this as a doctor, just as somebody who's curious about these issues, I believe PCOS corresponds with higher androgen levels and with a hormonal imbalance. So, and we know plastics can cause endocrine disruption for both males and females. So for males, I believe that the phthalates, which are the chemicals in plastics that make them soft and pliable, disrupt the male system. And whereas the opposite, I think, like the things that are in BPA, things that harden plastics, mimic estrogens and can disrupt the female system. I am sure I'm oversimplifying it. I'm not an endocrinologist. Do your own research if you're listening. But my point is that there are endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment. And I think that that plays a role that we're not talking about. But I think that there has to be a combination of something going on biologically, at least for some people, but also this meme, this thought form, this very convincing very appealing narrative that really gets at a lot of our human emotional vulnerabilities, especially the ones young adults are going through. If they're struggling with identity, belonging, insecurity, shame.
Major.
Yeah, I mean, no, teenagers going through normal teenage stuff, like the discomfort of your body changing with puberty, are told that that means that you're trans. So it's definitely a narrative that's being sold that appeals to young people's emotional needs. And so you combine the two, the whatever is going on a biochemical level, if anything, with people's underlying vulnerabilities, and then this appealing narrative coming into the rescue, and it's sort of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So it's not being born into the wrong body so much as the body being in a hostile environment and maybe something of an element of a social contagion. We could talk about that. Or what do you think about adverse childhood events, trauma? I've heard people talk about using EMDR to try to resolve trauma and that being a possible path to resolving gender dysphoria. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So, as we've seen this exponential rise in the last decade or so of youth presenting with gender related distress, it's been my observation that the population has shifted over time. So, the more popular this becomes, the more sort of quote unquote normal kids are getting sucked into it. I would say it started more on the fringes. So, the kids like the one I was, I'm sympathetic to this issue because I think I would have been one of these kids, right? I was awkward, I had been bullied, I wasn't particularly so-called gender conforming. I had a lot of risk factors, right? So I think if you look 5 or 10 years ago, the kids more likely to get swept into this were the ones with more trauma, the ones with attachment issues, ones who had been adopted or in foster care. Definitely children with autism are overrepresented in this population and other underlying comorbidities, as well as kids who are more likely to grow up to be lesbian or gay. But today, it has gotten so big and so popular that the average kind of middle class white kid knows that it's not cool to be an average middle class white kid. And so it really comes down to identity politics. But yeah, that being said, adverse childhood experiences and trauma certainly set someone up for the feelings of awkwardness and dissociation, disconnection from their body, and vulnerability that make them more likely to fall into this.
So, and then going back to that element of you said use the language of being like swept away. Is that how you're describing this that element of social contagion of this narrative?
Yeah, for many parents, it feels like their children are being swept away too, right? Then, and sometimes when I talk to parents, there is sort of a cult-like dynamic that they're observing in their kids sort of pulling away. And there is in the culture too, from what I've observed of the culture of people who are identifying with this stuff, a lot of sort of paranoid narrative toward the outside world. Like you can only associate with us, the rest of the world doesn't. At best, the rest of the world doesn't get you, or they're not as special or as cool as you. But at worst, they're out to kill you. You're being genocided. So it's very isolating.
Yeah, I bet. So, what advice would you offer to parents whose children are struggling with? What are some steps that they could take to help them through this period in their lives that will likely 90% resolve down the line? But how do we get from point A to point B and you kind of like deal with the suffering in the in between?
So this is what I talk about probably several hours a day. Almost everyone asks me this towards the end of every interview. And I'd say probably half of my clients at this point are parents who are worried about their kids. And of course, every family is different. And I wish that I could speak as optimistically as you just did. When I said that 90% of children this gender dysphoria will result on its own, that's from studies from before it became the norm for every kid who has a I think I might be trans day to immediately be affirmed and put on puberty blockers in their doctor's office. So it's like, yes, it would have resolved had it not been treated in this way. But now there are kids being ushered along this path. So my advice to parents, first of all, know your rights in your state, know your parental rights, know your rights in your child's school system, because your rights to know if the school is keeping secrets, your rights to know if your kid's trying to be going by a different name, those vary from one district to another, one state to another. So first get familiar with your rights. Also, buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. So try to take care of yourself and your marriage. make sure you're taking care of your health and practice good sleep hygiene because if you're too stressed out, you're not going to get anywhere and this might take a while. If you have a faith, pray, lean on it
Or even if you don't, maybe
and
it's time to start.
yeah, and then I would say working on strengthening your connection with your kid, getting them outside, getting them physically active, getting them off of screens, thinking about what leverage you still have, because a lot of parents are losing leverage. Once your kid's 18 or out of the house or financially independent, you don't have much leverage left, right? So think about what leverage do you have? What does your kid care about that you still have control over? And not to be harsh or cruel or punitive with it, but how can you set some loving parental limits so that your kid doesn't have full access to screen time? They have to earn monitored access to screen time. Don't be naive about what apps and websites your kid is on. Familiarize yourself with what your kid is being exposed to and get them building experiences that develop their real sense of competence because that's where a real identity comes from. An identity is something that takes years to develop. Kids build alter egos. That's something I mentioned earlier. So let's come back to that. I talk to parents a lot about the alter ego that their child is constructing and the role that that serves for them. So is it a weapon? Is it a shield? Is it substituting for some feeling of weakness deep down? So, with a lot of these trans identified girls, which make about 80% of trans identified youth, they adopt a male alter ego. And the male alter ego is cool, confident, collected, not easily phased, certainly not shy, awkward, geeky, needy, or extra, right? And so they can sort of hide their feminine vulnerability or that awkward little girl that they once were underneath this cool, tough exterior of this male alter ego that they've built. And there's something similar but reverse going on with some of these males who are identifying as females, where many of them are maybe sensitive boys that felt at odds with machismo or with alpha male energy, or felt like they couldn't live up to or couldn't compete with those types of males growing up, whether it was their peers or their dad. And so they sort of hide behind femininity as an escape from what they feel like the pressures and demands of participating and performing as a competitive or aggressive male. So there are all sorts of things like this where I work with parents to understand what is the type of alter ego that your child is constructing and what purpose does that serve for them? When you think about what an alter ego does, it's like scaffolding. So parenting is all about scaffolding, right? You provide the whatever the developmentally appropriate amount of structure is around the activity. So we just had a little pause because your 3-year-old son came in. So there's probably things where you're doing 90% of the work when he's 3 years old, right? And when he's 5, you're going to be doing 50% of the work. And when he's 10, you're going to be doing 10% of the work. So you know what it's like to scaffold the development of various skills and then take steps back as your son learns those skills at different stages. So identity is like that too, right? These kids are building an identity and it's not going to be complete until they're well into their 20s. And then it's going to continue to evolve from there, but it's at least going to be more solid by 30. So imagine being 50 and knowing that you're supposed to have an identity because you have social consciousness and you're aware of your peers, but you're trying on different hats and personas and you're trying on different interests in trying to build some semblance of sort of false identity so that from there you can scaffold and build the existence of a real solid identity. So if you look at the function that your kid's alter ego they've constructed is serving, then you get more insight. And I always tell parents knowledge is power. So try not to get into these headbutting arguments where you're just trying to fight their logic with your own logic because your kids are programmed not to hear you. They're embedded in this ideology that tells them everything out of your mouth is transphobic and they don't want to hear it. So there's no use throwing facts at them if they're not open to it, but try to understand what their behavior is actually communicating to you about their vulnerabilities and then relate to them in those vulnerabilities and look at how you can help them develop a real sense of identity, which again will take time, through experiences that cultivate competence. And that's where I mean getting physically active, building, fixing, creating, making art, and so on, because from there they get that intrinsic reward of contributing meaningfully and they learn to appreciate the power and strength of their bodies. If your kids are expressing gender dysphoria, then depending on your parenting style, the culture they're involved in, they might be making all kinds of excuses for not being physically active. And there are kids who have untreated eating disorders. There are kids who refuse to shower because they've been exposed to all this ideology that tells them if you're gender dysphoric, you're trans, then you should feel so disgusted by your own body that you're afraid to shower. They're reading these things from other kids. It's the blind leading the blind. So they're neglecting themselves, right? So the one of the best things you can do is keep your kids active, use whatever leverage you have, whatever it is they're motivated by, to make sure that they are engaging in some kind of activities. And remember what your kids' roots are, whatever your culture, your faith, your community that you've raised your kids in, try to reconnect them to those roots. And that gives them something to come back to. And finally, remember that you're not fully in control of this, but try not to turn every moment into an argument about gender, because at the end, well, first of all, that might push them further away. It doesn't mean you should give up. It doesn't mean you should lie to your kids. I don't believe in lying to your children. I don't believe in calling your daughter your son just to appease her alter ego. I think you should remain truthful, but also refuse to keep fighting about this and try to have meaningful experiences together. Even while your daughter is calling herself a boy, don't let that stop you from going out and having these experiences, because then, even if your kid does end up wasting years of their life going down the wrong path, at least they don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater years later when they regret it, because they still have some positive memories. Even if those memories are tainted by this false sense of self, at least they had some experiences they can look back on.
Wonderful. Well, as we close, is there anything else that we haven't already discussed that you think listeners should know?
When you put it that way, not really. I talk I talk to so many people all the time. If you want to hear more from me, there's always
Yes,
more.
maybe let's close with that. Where can listeners find more?
Sure. So you can watch our film, No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care, at nowaybackfilm.com. And if you'd like to get 20% off, you can use my promo code SomeTherapist. SomeTherapist is also my handle on all social media, Twitter and Instagram. It is my website, sometherapist.com. It is my YouTube handle, youtube.com/@sometherapist. And you can find my podcast, You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, for No Way Back, you can follow No Way Back on Twitter at 2022 Affirmation and on Instagram at Affirmation Generation, which again was the old name of the film.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Samantha. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.